By Laurie Garrett, who's Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations, only her most recent of many stellar accomplishments. This is, as you know, a lecture in the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative seminar series. This lecture series is sponsored by the Hertog Global Strategy Initiative and the Hertog family. Thank you to Roger Hertog for the funding. Co-sponsored by the Center for the History and Ethics of Public Health at the Mailman School and the Department of History. And we thank the Communications Office at the Mailman School for the refreshments tonight. I also wanted to tell you, for those of you for whom one lecture is not enough, of course we have these weekly, but there's also a course that Sarah Bergstresser is offering. The second session, the new session, is starting on July 5th through August 11th, and that's available through summer sessions. So those of you who would like to also have a discussion to go with it, you can register 2 credits, and information is available on the Hertog website or the Columbia Summer Sessions website, and it's open to all Columbia students. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Laurie Garrett here tonight. She, of course, is well known. She has won every award in journalism, the Pulitzer, the Peabody, the Polk, and then after that, of course, there was nothing left to do, so she moved on to run the program in global health at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she has really been able to expand, I think, her palette beyond the many classics she's already provided and given us. She has a new book coming out. Many of you, I hope, are already familiar with her classic books, The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, which remains, every time I go into the bookstore, I can still find copies on the shelf. So I highly recommend it, and really a classic in the field. And followed up by Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, which indeed I think was an appropriate lead-in to her current interest in the future of global health, a serious situation which obviously involves the kind of serious thinking that Laurie Garrett can bring to it. And for that reason, we're particularly delighted to welcome you here tonight. She also has another book coming out. It's going to be published electronically in about 2 weeks, I understand. I Could Hear the Sirens Scream, America's Response to 9/11. And as the other books, there will be many interesting revelations and I think much very good writing. So to give you a chance to experience what Laurie Garrett has to say, and I think a very special treat for us tonight on the future of global health, Laurie Garrett.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for coming this evening. And I know that your focus here in this series is on pandemics. I will touch on it, but I hope I'm providing a larger framework in terms of the ability of society to respond to pandemic threats, whether it's HIV, flu, or what have you. And to get started, here we go. So, first of all, you have to understand, where are we with global health and how did we get here? We've seen a phenomenal growth in funding for global health. It came over a very short period of time. It was sloppy, it was fast, it saw tremendous donor complexity. It was heavily biased towards treatment, medicalizing global health. It has been impaired by the world financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And I'm going to walk you through these key points and explain to you where I think it's all going and how the ability of the world to respond to a pandemic fits in, particularly given the many distractions that political leaders have at this time, and the incoming new Congress and its budgetary priorities, how that will influence global health. So let's start with sloppy, fast, sloppy, urgent, huge expansion of global health overnight. Well, I think most of you were like in junior high school or grammar school. And it is a commitment that began in the 1990s with a total spending of about $5.6 billion that covered water supplies, drugs, everything, the whole spectrum of what we call global health. It was overwhelmingly public health until HIV came along and finally got the attention that it merited. But in the early days, only about $300 million went for all aspects of HIV, condom distribution, treatment, you name it. As a result, the world could be accused of horrible negligence, of not caring and not showing concern about millions and millions of people becoming infected and dying around outside of the wealthy world. It was indeed an unfolding pandemic that was already out of control before governments began to seriously address it, and now is the third largest pandemic in world history and will shortly eclipse the Black Death of the Middle Ages, leaving swine flu 1918 in the #1 position. So our first problem, how do you get the political and economic leadership of the world to care? Well, it started with WHO, which was the big kahuna in the 1980s and 90s. Nothing else was on the stage. And they actually walked away from HIV/AIDS. They shut their program down in the early 1990s and said, the heck with it. It was a huge and unbelievably gross political venture at the time. Having abandoned it, the global community said, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. Something has to come to fore. And so this strange entity was created called UN-AIDS. That's actually a coalition of 6 United Nations agencies, of which WHO is one piece. It started in 1995 as the first genuine UN response to the epidemic after the shutdown of the WHO program, and it was greeted by most governments with total denial. Okay, flash forward, where are we today? Thanks to a star-studded cast of business people, celebrities, and political leaders, we've had a total explosion in the amount of money brought to bear, not just for HIV, but global health writ large, in settings like Davos and the TED conferences and World Bank meetings. If you look at the distribution at this point, the global distribution for AIDS itself, about 7.6 billion in total disbursements in 2009, and the United States is by far the biggest giver. Nothing comes close. And there is an expectation, once you've put people on treatment, that that money will be there every year and continue to flow. If you take health writ large, not just HIV, again, you see this spectacular growth from all the way up to about $26.4 billion by 2008. And again, the United States, a major player, with the EU, the second giant player on the field. How is it distributed? Overwhelmingly, it's about HIV, that giant blue bar at the top, but also, interestingly, the giant orange bar, which generally is channeled not through classic health, but through development channels, is water systems. What's grossly under deployed is resources for healthcare worker development and training, and for the essential infrastructure of health. So you're piling on this enormous burden for treatment, specifically for HIV and secondarily for other disorders, but you're not really providing resources to allow an infrastructure to implement those targets and to train the necessary healthcare workers, regardless of their sub-profession, to execute the functions that you're targeting. So this then takes us to problem number 2, huge sloppy expansion of money, and it's so complex. This is a chart of U.S. global health donation under the Bush administration. How would you like to be on the receiving end of this? It's some Ministry of Health trying to figure out what agency in Washington is doing the, spot checking and is responsible for the grants that your department has received. And even if you know what agency it came from, the sub-agencies are a bunch of alphabet soups to try and keep track of. And they go channel through, global health actually channels through 43 different agencies of the United States government. It is not all through health channels. Most of it actually comes through the State Department and is part of the overall State Department smart power or soft power programs. So, recap, we've gone from one agency on the field and the WHO finally coming back to, since then, this absolute expansion, not only of money, but of how many players are on the field, and claim leadership, claim the right to dictate the policies, claim the right to decide the whole direction and priorities of global health. It's become so complicated that almost no one can really keep track of who's deciding what agendas, who's in charge. And by the way, just on HIV alone, there have been 60,000 new NGOs created practically overnight to deal just with HIV, the majority of them focused on Africa. So if you're at the Ministry of Health and all these agencies are coming at you, and all these NGOs are coming at you, and they all want just a little bit of your time and the right to march into your country and execute a program that may be in conflict with your own national policies, it's overwhelming, truly overwhelming. Well, of course, the other big player that jumped into the field starting in 1999 was Bill and Melinda Gates and their foundation. From the very beginning, they were putting kinds of money, quantities out that were absolutely overwhelming and unprecedented in the history of private giving. And total, that giant orange chunk is the health piece of all Bill and Melinda Gates giving, which has now exceeded $23 billion in a very short amount of time, the vast majority of it gone out the door just in the last 5 years. The other new entity, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, is unique. It's a funding mechanism unlike anything for any category of problems you may choose to deal with. It's actually a granting mechanism. Started dispersing in 2002. By 2003 or 2008, it was up to 2.3 billion. Now it's in a budget crisis. Has failed to meet its replenishment goals, rather dramatically so, and is unable to fulfill commitments to countries. If you look at the breakdown of money for the Global Fund, again, the United States is the major donor. We give about 1/3 of the money from our taxpayers, and add in what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives, and we are by far the major donor as Americans that keeps the Global Fund alive. How bad is the shortfall? The Global Fund said to achieve its targets, it needed by 2015 a total expenditure of $20 billion new dollars. In fact, donors have come up with only about 11.7 billion, which means the shortfall is very dramatic and very acute, and countries will not get what they need for their malaria, TB, and HIV programs. Which takes us to problem number 3, the medicalization of global health. Remember, I told you it started out as public health. When Obama came into office, he inherited PEPFAR, amongst other programs, which was the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief created by George Bush. It was a brilliant program in the sense that it moved a lot of money very fast for AIDS treatment, but it had no transparency, it had never been assessed, it had no quality standards, so who knew if it was working or not? Who knew if the dollars were well spent or not? We deserve better than that. And so the Obama administration spent about the first year of the president's first term assessing PEPFAR and a variety of other global health programs, trying to come up with a new strategy, a more accountable strategy. And the first thing they noticed was that virtually everything about HIV programs and TB and malaria was based on cottage industries. Tiny, minuscule, mostly NGO or faith-based run programs that had been at one village or one part of one country. Perhaps they had indeed worked very well in that specific cultural setting or village setting in which they operated, but who knew if they could scale up? And indeed, scale up capacity building has proven a very difficult and moving target for every aspect of executing a larger HIV agenda and malaria and TB. And we've not done terribly well on prevention. We have now about 35 million people living with HIV/AIDS, 34 million if you take the best estimate from UNAIDS. And the numbers keep on mounting. About 2.6 million annually are newly infected with HIV/AIDS. So we have, as a public health measure, failed entirely with the HIV pandemic. Well, the new target set by UNAIDS is 0. 0 new infections, 0 untreated infections once they occur. Getting to such a bold target will be a tough one, though we do have new evidence that treatment lowers transmissibility dramatically. So perhaps if we can more aggressively treat, we can also reduce the spread. Despite expansion of treatment, however, we continue to have AIDS deaths. The numbers have gone down, but here on the 30th anniversary, we have to recognize that we're continuing to fail. And UNAIDS thinks if they can get enough money and the programs can be adequately funded, which they are not now, we might be able to hold down the new infection rates, now up to a cumulative possibly 75 million people. One of the reasons we're having so much trouble controlling it is that governments continue to use non-scientific bases for determining what their HIV prevention policies will be. And this means that 29 to 35 million people so far have died, many of them needlessly so, need not have been infected in the first place. But governments don't like to talk about sex, don't like to talk about IV drug use, don't like to talk about the things that are actually responsible for spread, such as that 1 out of every 5 ID drug users in the world are already infected with HIV. That's a battle we have lost, and we have lost in every single country in the world. $15.9 billion worth of resources to commit by 2009 to low and middle income countries with a goal of getting a million people more in universal access. We're up to about 6 million people in developing countries now receiving antiretroviral drugs. Our primary emphasis then for all this enterprise related to HIV is on treatment. Prevention has taken a distant back seat. And treatment, when they first rolled out PEPFAR in 2003, was thought to be easy because, hey, it was just handing out pills, right? Turns out countries don't have the absorption capacity for billions of dollars overnight. They don't even have the banking systems, the finance systems, much less the actual infrastructure of health to spend the money. So money was sitting in bank accounts unspent and backlogged. Secondly, we didn't have any gold standard for achievement. So we had no way, and we still don't have a way, to say to any given government or NGO or faith-based organization, this is the model, now go out and implement it, and we'll test and see if you made the gold standard. So everybody's doing it the way they feel they should do it, and judging by their standards, their metrics, what achievements they may or may not have made. And I see that the program is inserting odd little gibberish for some reason into my slides. Well, as they went along, one of the things that everybody got to, certainly by 2006, was, wait a minute, we're doing primary health care. We called it handing out pills, but hey, I'm an NGO, I'm a faith-based group, I'm right here in the middle of chronic disease management, and guess what? Chronic disease management has never previously been a part of anybody's foreign aid programs. So we don't have a model for how to do that. We don't do it for diabetes. We don't do it for cancer care. So let's take a breath and see what we just did. We didn't think about it consciously. We didn't have a strategy. We just did it, and boom, overnight. We started out global health equals public health. You know, vaccines, water supplies, the classics. And without thinking about it, it shifted and it became medical treatment. And not only medical treatment, but non-curative, lifelong chronic care. We medicalized this entire thing we call global health. We turned it into a medical treatment model without any conscious strategic discussion or debate. It just happened. Now we're saddled with what we did without really strategically thinking about it, without analyzing our thoughts and our plans as we went forward. And what have we discovered? Well, first of all, we don't have any healthcare workers. And second of all, we don't have an infrastructure. So boom, we walked into these waters and discovered that most poor countries lack the capacity to execute our grand strategies. And you know, infrastructure is not just, do you have a clinic? It's, do you have a paved road to get to the clinic? The healthcare worker crisis is very severe. The best estimates are that we have about 60 million people involved in health as their profession. Dentists, lab techs, doctors, nurses, what have you. Highly skewed to North America and Europe, and within every country, highly skewed to the cities. There are about the deficit of 4.3 million healthcare workers, with the most acute deficit being in the hardest hit and most needy countries, of sub-Saharan Africa, a deficit of about 1 million healthcare workers. But many Asian countries have extreme deficits, and so do a number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So let's recap. We plunged straight ahead, and then we went, uh-oh, we don't have healthcare workers, and we don't have an infrastructure. And here we are. The commitments are made. We're clear on this, right? Okay, so let's go forward. What happened next? And where are we now? Well, the World Bank suddenly declared that we'd created a giant, what's called moral hazard argument. We had hooked one Ministry of Health after another, one NGO program after another on external funding, so that it reached the point where many governments now have ministries of health that are more than 50% dependent on external sources of funding. Who's calling the shots then? Who decides the policies? Is it the government of Kenya, the government of Uganda, or is it possible that because they hold the purse strings, the Bush administration says abstinence works, and now you're all going to implement abstinence policies? It doesn't matter what you think works, what your cultural trends are. We've decided, we're the funders, now go out there and implement the program we've decided. This is the classic moral hazard argument, and it is one that now haunts almost every aspect of global health implementation around the world, particularly in countries that have very weak infrastructures. The second problem is because we didn't have a gold standard for what we were trying to achieve, we also don't have an exit strategy. So we haven't been designing global health programs intended to be sustainable and eventually completely handed over to the host governments or the host NGOs. We haven't even thought about it. So how long is this gravy train supposed to run? Well, boom, along comes 2008, the world financial crisis, and it's not a silly question anymore. It's a very urgent question. How long will the gravy train last? How long does the flow of cash for this whole exercise come from one part of the world to the other? We very immediately saw some macabre things happen. For example, in Kenya, hospitals stopped releasing cadavers until the families paid off the hospital bills. In China, many hospitals will kick a patient out as soon as their family runs out of money, regardless of whether their treatment has been fulfilled. We've started to see all sorts of macabre distortion effects on local health provisions, not just for HIV, but for all health care. But the interesting thing about the 2008 financial crisis is that it was also the beginning of a massive restructuring of global economics, because what we experience as pain is actually pleasure and delight for the BRICS countries, Brazil, China, India, the countries that are getting rich while we're suffering and seeing a decline in our economic capacities. And this has already resulted in a dramatic shift in world politics. So what used to be the G8 world, with the classic European, Japanese, US triangle, is now the G20 world. It's their world. We just happen to live in it. They're in the driver's seat, and the key drivers are Brazil, China, and India. They're not just driving the economy, they're driving all global policies and multilateral policies, which includes much of what we call global health. And they're doing so while still being recipients of aid. So add to the financial crisis, we went into the world food inflation crisis. The first stage of it began in 2007 and peaked in mid-2008 with dramatic increases in costs of basic grains. Rice was the big one then. We're now in the stage 2 of the world financial crisis, affecting primarily wheat and corn, and it is devastating in poor countries. It's hurting even here on your financial wallet. The 2008 price increases were most sharply felt in the poorest countries, surprise, surprise. And as rice prices drove upwards in a spiral that was completely out of control, people realized that we had never really, as a global community, addressed food. We'd never really addressed adequately agricultural capacity and capacity building in poor countries. So we had zero resilience. Before the crisis hit, we were already pressed to make needs felt for food around the world. Once the crisis did hit, the president of the World Bank said 100 million people had overnight been driven into acute life-threatening poverty by the increase in food prices in 2008. It was so dramatic, we've never seen anything like it before. Unprecedented. It caused riots all over the world for food. Philippines, Haiti, Pakistan, everywhere you turned. I was in Bangladesh and saw riots breaking out over access to rice. And even as this was happening, the rich world's actual commitment to both provision of food resources and agricultural development went down rather than up and responsive to the crisis. Now we're in the second big one, and we've actually hit the highest prices for basic foods in world history, either in a direct current dollar expenditure or evaluated according to historic dollar values. The big driver this time, wheat and corn. And that is secondarily affecting all meat prices and virtually everything else that you eat. As you can see, the red lines are 2011, so we started with a corn price in 2011 that was already higher than anything except the absolute peak in 2008, and we've now surpassed that. Corn prices have increased more than 61%. This is an old slide for January. The real startling increases have occurred in the last few months. Rice is going up, but not quite as dramatically as in 2008 for a variety of reasons related to what's being hoarded and what's the nature of market speculation in the global commodities market. The big speculation is corn now, and the hoarding is on wheat. Why is wheat getting hoarded? Because of the great fires of Ukraine and Russia last summer, and the Russian and Ukrainian government have put a complete clamp on all exports of wheat. Why is this happening? Well, one reason, of course, is there's more of us that are hungry, more of humans eating. But more importantly, happily, more and more of humanity is entering the middle class. And when you become middle class, the first thing you want is meat, and more of it. You want a chicken in every pot. You want a steak on Sunday. And this puts tremendous demand on both grain resources and land resources, far more than the growing of produce. The second problem is that we've never invested in agricultural development in countries where women are the farmers. That is all of Africa and most of Southeast Asia. So where women are the labor force, they are farming with the same techniques used 2,000 years ago. A hand hoe, a baby on the back, and maybe some fertilizer. We've actually seen that investment in those women has gone down, not up, in response to the crisis. So if we spend less on agricultural development, we increase food dependency. If people can't grow their own food and we're not helping them to learn how, then we're ensuring that every time food costs inflate, the pressure will be either we starve to death or you start figuring out how to give us humanitarian relief. So again, just as I've already described to you that dependency is increasing in global health, it's also increasing at the same time in food, basic food. And why am I talking in a health discussion about food? Obviously because if you're not eating, you're unhealthy. Meanwhile, the amount of land that people could farm is disappearing overnight. We're seeing the fastest devastation of arable land in known history. I mentioned the fires that destroyed wheat crops. Severe weather events are becoming more common and are having a devastating impact on food production. You know, the floods in Pakistan and India last year were larger than the total size of Western Europe. Australia was under flood in its primary agricultural zone larger than the size of Germany and France combined. So you look at the contributors that are driving this food dependency / inflation. There are classic issues, there are demand issues, there's market speculation. Oil prices affect the cost of fertilizer and the transport of foods. Extreme weather events are becoming more and more severe. Arable land is disappearing, and with that, a lot of potable water. Well, how did the G20, I told you, they're in the driver's seat now, not the G8. How did they respond to all of this? They held a crisis meeting in February. Nicolas Sarkozy was the chair. They said, oh, this is so bad. We have to do something about this. And that's about it. There were some commitments made. Some money was going to flow in certain directions. Most of it has never appeared in its targeted directions. And the $22 billion pledged over 3 years, including the U.S. portion, has largely never materialized to help poor countries improve their agricultural capacities. And countries vowed to stop stockpiling and hoarding, and they have not done so. By and large, protectionist barriers continue to be severe. And market speculators, you know, the guys that brought us the world financial crisis in the first place, are now wildly speculating in the food price arena, which drives the prices even worse. And there's zero transparency in those markets. Now, look at the red line. That's 2011. That's where we started with prices in the beginning of the year. November is usually when pricing peaks. What in the world are food prices going to look like this fall? If current trends mean anything, here's meat prices, and they're steadily rising. It's a good reflection of both demand and petroleum costs because of the huge transport costs associated with getting meat to the marketplace. You could project out and see a pretty terrifying prospect. No one I know imagines a way that world food prices come down, only flatline or steadily worse. So again, the G20 said, oh my goodness, we have a crisis. Let's meet again. They had another meeting in June. And once again, they promised to be transparent and do something. They did nothing. They created a database to keep track of rising food prices. So what happened? Corn hit the highest ever in world history. And demand starkly went up. One of the reasons corn is so sensitive is that about 40% of American corn goes to feed gas tanks, not human beings. And ethanol is driving this inflation heavily. But Oxfam also has estimated where we're going to be. I don't know if you can see this in this light, but where we're going to be with food prices due to climate change impacts, severe weather events, and so on. The shaded areas are where food prices will be just the portion of increase due to climate change by 2030. And the lower lines are where we already see inflation. Their estimates are it's going to drive mass starvation events, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and that it's going to become more obvious and more severe every single year, primarily not due to heat, as people imagine, but severe weather events. Okay, problem 6. We're overwhelmed. And our political leaders have so much on their agendas now, it's staggering. You know, start with the earthquake in Haiti and then an earthquake in Japan. The pandemic of flu, the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. It seems an unprecedented level of catastrophic events that our major leaders, including our president, are saddled with. On top of it all, huge indebtedness for us, driven heavily by the cost of 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, now estimated to have already cost since 2001, $3.7 trillion and 225,000 lives lost, civilian and military combined. This is from Brown University's Cost of War Index, an interesting website. Problem 7, the U.S. political system is a mess. And now it's a mess that wants nothing but budget cutting. A lot of people in America believe that about 25% of the U.S. budget is sent overseas. It's actually less than 1% of our U.S. budget goes overseas for anything other than military goods, and it's shrinking by the microsecond. If you look at it as a pie chart, global health spending under the Obama, called the Global Health Initiative, I told you he redesigned global health spending, is a very trivial portion, about 0.8% of the federal budget. Nevertheless, it has no constituency politically to protect it, so it's very vulnerable to budget cutting. Many critics of global health claim that the countries stop spending if we give them money, and actually the trend shows the opposite. In every region of the world, national spending, domestic spending on health is increasing. So even the poorest countries on the planet are spending more of their own resources. It's not the case that if we give them money, they stop spending their own. So let's drill down on this global health initiative that Obama has created, and how does it work and what is it dealing with? Well, of course, it's overwhelmingly about HIV, and I already told you that HIV is overwhelmingly about treatment versus prevention. If you combine what we give to the Global Fund, the HIV portion of that, plus direct PEPFAR HIV spending, that's about 2/3 of the total pie of the Global Health Initiative. It called for a steady increase in spending, but not at the spectacular pace that some advocates wanted to see Obama advocate for. We would be spending right now in fiscal year 2011 $9.6 billion, but then we got nervous about a budget axe coming, which I'll get to in a few minutes. We are spending as a percentage of our GDP very, very generously now as American taxpayers. For a long time, Jeffrey Sachs here from Columbia was criticizing how much was spent, saying that we were not spending our fair share of GDP to help the poor of the world. But now we are at that 0.8% magic point, and there are only 3 countries in the world that donate more as a percentage of their GDP than we do. HIV is, most of this growth in the amount of money for HIV is coming from the Gates Foundation, the Global Fund, which is, as I told you, 1/3 U.S. taxpayer supported, and direct U.S. taxpayer funding the United States government, that giant dark section at the bottom. So as you can see, I personally look at this as a source of pride. As an American taxpayer, some of my money really is keeping people alive all over the world. At this point, American taxpayers are responsible for 58% of all global HIV programming and 52% of global health overall. A source of pride, but also a source of vulnerability. Think about that very carefully. Keep those numbers in your head. More than half of the global pot. And the Gates Foundation is responsible for 68% of all private giving related to global health on planet Earth today. One foundation calls the shots on all private giving related to global health. In fact, I would argue that the 2 Washingtons are controlling this thing we call global health, Seattle and the District of Columbia. Nothing comes close to the impact and influence these 2 entities have, and to what would happen if they walked away. One exception, David Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, last week made a massive, more than $3 billion commitment in a time of great fiscal difficulty in his country, in fact, riots today, as all the school teachers of the UK went on strike over their austerity programs. They have their own unemployment and recession difficulties. Nevertheless, he said, we owe it to the world to deal with vaccinating poor children. Their money went to Gavi, and together with Bill Gates, they pushed the Gavi replenishment, this is the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, well past what was the request level of $3.7 billion to $4.3 billion, for a total nut of $7.6 billion for childhood vaccination. This has been Bill Gates' big #1 priority, that and the eradication of polio. But where does all this leave the World Health Organization? So remember, I told you when I started the talk, they used to be the only game in town. And now Margaret Chan, the director, is facing a $1 billion shortfall right this minute. She is having to cut programs right and left. 1 out of 5 WH employees is losing their jobs, getting laid off. The organization is shrinking down dramatically. Their 2-year budget is less than half of the Gavi budget. So global vaccines, HIV, WHO, everything else about health, shrinking. With this is a shrinkage of their influence, their policy drive, their political leadership over this enterprise we call global health. To take you back to 1990, that green bar was WHO, biggest game in town. Second biggest, United States government and our foreign assistance programs. And some of the Europeans came in behind that. If you compare the 1990 figures to where we are today and the entry of all kinds of new players into the field, you can see that WHO, again in the green, has shrunk in significance. The U.S. government, way #1, but the Global Fund, that's that GFAT-TM, NGOs generally actually give more than WHO itself. And you can go on down the list and see this. Now, what's the trend that I would forecast for the next 3 years? I see U.S. support declining thanks to the Republican Congress. With that will come a decline for the Global Fund, a severe decline for WHO, huge increases for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's giving. The UK will continue to modestly increase. Gavi will be the major recipient of this increase in support, but the EU is declining thanks to Greece, Portugal, Spain crises, and UNFPA will see a decline because the United States will cease backing family planning and reproductive health programs. Now, why am I giving you this horrible look at this? It realigns everything about global health, everything we think we're doing. So here we are, we're talking about pandemics. If WHO is falling apart, we shut down the National Center for Infectious Diseases at CDC. CDC's program for emergency response is greatly reduced. So who the heck responds in the next pandemic if WHO is gutted? Is this our responsibility? Taxpayers of America? Are we the ones that are going to fix this mess? Not according to the Republican leadership in Congress. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who's of Cuban descent and sees the #1 priority of all foreign assistance to bring down Fidel Castro, you laugh, but hey, it's true, has asked of global health, what's the return on our investment? What do we get out of it? Nada. Shut it down. She controls the House Foreign Operations Committee. The head of the House Appropriations Committee agrees with her and says, I hate the UN, so stop giving any money to any UN program. All right, so let me back up 1 second, make sure you know we're set the stage here. Where were we a month ago? Do you all remember this giant fight on the continuing resolution for the budget of 2011? Did any of you know what I'm talking about? Raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Okay, some of you don't. This was huge and almost unprecedented in our political history. The Republican Party said, when the new Tea Party element came in, you know what, we're going to stop the budget right now. No more checks get written for not next year, for the budget right this minute. No more NIH grants, checks get written. No more foreign anything get written. While we have a continuing resolution to vote on how much of this budget that was already passed, already allocated, already approved, will actually go out the door. Their goal, what they promised as the Tea Party campaigners was, we're going to eliminate $100 billion from this year's budget. What they actually did, after thrashing about, fighting, the White House valiantly standing up to defend, they mainly targeted the State Department. They cut $8.4 billion worth of State Department programs, which is where most global health is nested. Fortunately, in this round, most of the key global health programs were protected, and we actually saw a slight increase overall, only 66 million compared to last year in global health funding. But to put it in perspective, these dramatic cuts that they ultimately made represent an absolutely trivial portion of the national debt or deficit, which of course were allegedly the targets for this massive cutting drive. All right, so the real problem is what's going to happen now as we go into the fight over the fiscal year 2012 budget. Now, 2012 budget spending starts on October 1st of this year. The White House wants a modest increase for global health, a $9.8 billion up from 9.6. They want the biggest chunk of increase to go for family planning programs because they were completely unserved under the Bush administration, and a lot of mother-to-child maternal health programs. The GOP reverse wants to cut $1.5 billion out of global health. They want to eliminate all family planning spending, and they want to cut $1 billion out of NIH programming that specifically goes for research related to global health problems. Where is this going to end up? I don't think we can call it right now, but I know that we can say it's up to you, the taxpayers, to decide. This leaves us in a dependency cycle. We've got 6 million people we put on antiretrovirals. We can't suddenly stop treating them. If you do, they die. We know. We've seen the equation. The experiment's been done. You stop your antiretrovirals, you die, and usually quickly. So this leads us to ask, what exactly is this thing that we're calling global health today? The initiatives are clear, like the Gavi vaccination initiatives. That is a very clear mission. You know what it is. You can define it. It's very classic vertical programming. You march in, you vaccinate, you leave town. But WHO is not now considered a key element of this thing we call global health. it is shrinking. The Global Fund, which 3 years ago was the sexy thing we call global health, is also shrinking. The Gates Foundation, which I want to underscore this for a moment, it dominates. It not only dominates in terms of being the biggest private giver, it dominates in setting policy. Because every single global health program now in the world, and frankly, this whole school, the School of Public Health at Columbia, are utterly dependent on Gates money. And individual sub-programs are up to 100% dependent on Gates money. So the Gates Foundation is setting policy now for the whole world. They have no accountability. They don't have a board of directors. There's no transparency on any decision on funding made by the Gates Foundation whatsoever. The U.S. government, as I told you, is the big kahuna. And if we start cutting with the budget acts on U.S. support, it will have an immediate impact. Finally, we're heading towards September, when there will be a United Nations General Assembly special session to talk about diverting all our attention towards non-communicable diseases, so-called NCDs, the classic chronic diseases that are on the rise as more and more countries enter the age of affluence. Diabetes, cancer, heart disease, mental health problems, all the classic set of chronic disease issues that we face here in the United States. The problem is the recipes for solutions to the non-communicable disease set are far more complicated, put you right up against the food industry, right up against the tobacco industry, right up against a whole host of issues for which we've never really had an easy solution, even here in the United States, much less a global solution. Add on top of it, what about crises, severe weather events, earthquakes, bioterrorism? Is this all global health? And who's making those choices? What is global health? We have seen such a dramatic shift occur with such rapidity that I don't think if we took a poll in this room, we would have a solution. We would agree. So who decides it? Is it Bill Gates? Is it Ileana Ros-Lehtinen? Does the G20 define global health? Do the least development country governments define? Is it USAID or DFID or OECD? Is there such a thing as a health consumer out there that decides the definition of global health? Is it you here in this room? We don't have a mechanism. We're just letting it happen, haphazardly, without any strategic thinking. And when you look at it, given the severe shortage of healthcare workers and the infrastructure to support it, you can very clearly see everything skew towards two giant initiatives: vaccinating kids and HIV treatment. This takes us to ultimately our real background problem. We're really good at charity. We're not very good at maintenance, sustainability, long-term survival of any of our programs overseas. And I just want to finally go to the Department of Shameless Advertising. As you heard, I have a new book coming out. It'll be available on Amazon in 2 weeks, and it looks at 9/11 and anthrax. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our distinguished and always articulate speaker for that fascinating talk. The floor is now open for questions.
And please use the microphone so everybody, or else shout, so everybody can hear.
Professor
Ian.
Lipkin?
If you add private, I'm sorry, you need to speak.
Oh, you do need to use the microphone because they're filming it.
Sorry to interrupt, but, thank you.
If you take private and public giving by nation, what percentage of GDP is U.S. versus other nations?
Oh, as I said, we're at 0.8% of GDP. Oh, private giving, sorry. Very good point. Okay, we're at 0.8% of GDP for public giving. If you add in our private giving, and we are by far the most generous private givers on earth, it well takes us over the 1% of GDP level.
So that would be ahead of the other two.
Absolutely.
Okay. The second one was not really a question, it was a point. We don't take a lot of money from the Gates Foundation here, and the reason is because of the indirect cost strategy. So you don't, if you cannot cover the bills that are associated with taking the money, you can't take it. So there is very modest Gates support at Columbia.
Well, that may be true at Columbia, but I know that the Gates Foundation is the major supporter of most schools of public health outside of bench research areas.
This makes us unusual.
What, I just stun you into absolute
Yeah.
silence? Come on. What is global health, guys? Let's hear it.
So that's a way in which Columbia is unique anyway. So,
What is global health?
Yeah.
What do you guys think? Here comes some brave soul.
okay.
Sorry, not to answer your question, but I was just wondering if there's, if you've seen an upsurge in donations from these new emerging countries, BRIC, and I know the Gulf Cooperation Council, for example, gives, the governments state that they give billions and billions of dollars a year in global
That's not true.
development. Yeah, well, how much goes to setting up Wahhabi schools and how much goes up to public
Right.
health is unknown. But is there any shift among sort of Brazil, India, China?
So this is a very important question you're asking because, at the moment, China controls most of the world's debt and certainly most of our debt, and it has the largest supply of cash on planet Earth. India, Brazil, to a lesser degree, Russia, totally for reasons of energy and resources, and of course all the oil countries have vast reserves of wealth at this moment. And ironically, China remains one of the top recipients of global fund support for their HIV programs. And India continues to be a recipient of global health support. Both India and China have come under sharp criticism for that in the last 6 to 9 months and have started to make very public announcements about programs in which they're giving funding, they're giving support for global health, but it still isn't as much as they're receiving. And it's an odd dilemma. I think we'll work through it, but at this moment in the G20 context, you have almost a blatant contradiction. I think in part is, to be fair, I don't think that a country grows up overnight from absolute poverty to a major economic powerhouse and with a sense of global citizenry built in to the whole sort of fiber of the country. That doesn't happen overnight. It certainly didn't happen with us. We were not a foreign aid donor for more than the first 100 years of the existence of the United States. So, although we, of course, did donate to manipulate wars that were to our advantage. We have to be fair about our expectations, but also let's keep in mind that China and India in particular have tremendous health disparities domestically, with a lot of people locked into the infectious disease threat era, not yet making the health transition. So they have a tall order to achieve domestically, as well as becoming global health partners.
So sorry, I'm also not up here to answer your question, but I have a question of my own.
Chickens.
So earlier, just going back to an earlier section of your talk, you mentioned many inherent flaws in the global public health system that we have today, like this problem of the moral hazard, which came a little later, but also no exit strategies, no gold standard, things like this. And you also said that they dated back to problems like there was no supervision. This sort of happened overnight, and no one really understood who was in charge. But you also mentioned later that while it's sort of diminished and been shrunk in size, the World Health Organization back then was the primary contributor, and it sort of coordinated all of these efforts. So how is it possible that the World Health Organization would have allowed this sort of transformation, this like medicalization of global public health right under their very noses if they were still in control at the time?
Wow. I mean, first of all, I'm stunned at how well you paid attention to my remarks. You perfect recap. And your question is a good one. Often when I try to explain to people in the general public, not people with some college level interest in public health, that the state today of WHO, they're stunned and they can't understand how this could have happened. What in the world is going on there? And of course the answer is a bit complicated, but it begins with a real arrogance institutionally by WHO back in the 1980s and 90s. It was the only game in town. They decided everything. If any rival even tried to get into the field, WHO squashed them like a little bug. And unfortunately, at that time of great power and wealth, good funding, and so on, WHO became a victim of its own unique governance structure. So WHO is the only UN agency that actually has a legislative body, and by charter answers to a legislative body. It's not a very resilient or rapid agency as a result, because the legislative body, the World Health Assembly, only convenes once a year. And then when it does convene, often getting any kind of ruling passed is just a nightmare and can take, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of, a bizarre process in which a tiny country like Vanuatu has an equal proportional vote to China. And that means that Vanuatu could literally block legislation, if you will, through the World Health Assembly that affects 5 or 6 billion human beings. On top of that, long ago, WHO agreed to a regional structure, creating 8 regional offices. For us, does anybody know the name of our regional office? PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, which actually precedes the existence of WHO, but became the WHO regional office. The regional offices have become more and more powerful with time, and in some cases literally just ignore what Geneva tells them to do. And Margaret Chan can say all she wants, do X, Y, or Z, and they just, we're down in Brazzaville, ha ha ha. And so there, a kind of power struggle has worsened over time internally in WHO. And then finally, the coup de grace is that, along with that sort of governance structure, is, if you will, a taxation structure, so that countries proportional to their GDP are expected to give a certain amount of money annually as members of WHO, and that's meant to be the core budget of the institution. So 193 nations give various amounts of money. And the problem is that long ago, the taxation system ceased being adequate to support even the core functions of WHO. And so the wealthy countries became earmarked donors. And I'm sure if you think about the US Congress, you all know what's wrong with earmarking, right? You understand what earmarking is? It means that ultimately the United States can say, we'd like to see a nutrition program, and to aggressively get the world interested in nutrition. So we're going to give another $1 billion a year to WHO to build up a whole, nutrition empire. But by the way, as Americans, the way we define nutrition is set by McDonald's, right? So all of a sudden, the outside earmarked special programming is way more than the core budget. And WHO itself isn't calling the shots on what's the priorities of those programs. And then I think, as I suggested in my remarks, that the crucial mistake that set WHO on this path was getting rid of their HIV/AIDS program and walking away from the greatest pandemic since the existence of WHO.
Thanks. I guess I'll hazard a definition as part of my question.
Good for you.
So what is global health in the actual world? Just watching your presentation, it looks a lot, upsettingly so, a lot like the U.S. health system. It's a bunch of disparate programs incompletely cobbled together. And, the question stems from this. You've really presented a very catastrophic picture. And I want to ask, I and a lot of people in here are researchers or interested in research. I know just from experience that research doesn't usually dictate policy. But nevertheless, do you have a recommendation? What can we as researchers or even citizens do? What is the next step after recognizing catastrophe, basically?
Well, thank you for asking that. And here's, I think, the answer. We are fortunate that we live in this thing called a democracy. And those of us that live in New York are fortunate that our representative pool, both in the House and the Senate, is a reasonably smart, or there's among them some reasonably smart individuals. They need to hear from you. They need to know that global health and overseas development are not things you cut without paying a price. See, the reason all these overseas programs are always the first thing that you get rid of is sort of like the reason at the local level public health is what city governments get rid of when they start feeling a tight budget. It's that you don't see the reason you needed it until there's a crisis. Because when it's all working, nothing bad is happening. You know, there's no salmonella in the grocery market food if our city health department is on the job. And there's no polio spreading from Pakistan to the United States if global health is on the job, right? It requires a special kind of politician to see the need for that infrastructure when they don't feel the crisis, when there's not a catastrophe, to use your word. So, you know, Chuck Schumer really needs to know that you feel he will pay a price politically if he lets this stuff go down. Your congressman needs to know that, or congresswoman. They all need to know that. And if you have relatives that live in, you know, red states, we really need them mobilized. You need to be on the phone talking to friends and family all over America, or emailing them or whatever, tweeting like mad to make them understand that they have to make their political leaders shiver with fear. A good example of a creative effort, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen is the most powerful in the House on this problem. She comes from Miami, outside Miami. Surprise, surprise. She was born in Cuba. She's heavily supported by the Cuban American community. And she married into a Zionist family, so she's like a double whammy. She's rah-rah Israel, I hate Palestine. She's bring down Castro and turn all foreign assistance into regime change. And this sounds pretty grim. How are you ever going to get global health on her agenda? But Bread for the World, which is a pretty remarkable faith-based organization spread out all over the United States, has started mobilizing members of her congregation and to get them to say, we see it as a religious duty to, you know, be our brother's keeper, to share our wealth with the poor of the world, and to put pressure on her right there in her backyard. I think this is our hope. The rest of the world is counting on us to do this. And if we can't, then we let them all down.
Thank you. You mentioned land devastation and, you know, add to that other global environmental devastation and how that relates to health and relates to public health, relates to global health in many, many ways. And I'm wondering from your perspective, what organizations globally are looking at this, at the change, whether due to climate change or whether due to human activities, how that is influencing the
Well,
health
as
of
I
people.
point out, Oxfam is on the spot. But there are dozens and dozens of groups, actually. I mean, the good news is that there is now a considerable amount of attention to the impacts of climate change and catastrophic weather events. The bad news, of course, is that some major, I would say, ethical errors were committed by some key environmental scientists that resulted in a backlash against the whole climate agenda. And so there's a lot of rebuilding lost ground in that area. And there's an interesting article, where did I just read it, about Al Gore. Where did I just read this? Was it in yesterday's New York Times? No. That Al Gore himself is acknowledging that he strategically had made a series of mistakes that have given ground to the there is no such thing as climate change people.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of the discussion was actually on funding, and funding forms one side of the coin. I'm just wondering whether can we be looking at cost as well? What's your view on the cost of treatment per person? Is it going down? Is it going down fast enough, especially, say, in the case of AIDS treatment? That's my first question. And the second question I've got relates to pharma companies. What is the role of pharma companies in terms of helping the world to treat the global health problem?
So the good news is that indeed pharmaceutical costs for HIV drugs have gone down dramatically. And we hit a bump in the road about a year ago as more and more people who'd been put on primary antiretroviral therapy developed resistant virus and needed second-line therapy, and costs weren't budging. But again, some dramatic interventions in the last 9 months or so have seen those costs come down as well. And we do have a broader range of producers. We were very dependent on one generic producer in India to provide low cost, but it's really spreading out now, and we're getting a diversity of low-cost generic manufacturers, which is all good news. Your second question about pharma is one that we actually were having a healthy argument or discussion about in a seminar just before I came in here. Oh, it wasn't even an argument. Anyway, it was a discussion. And you know, pharma, I think there's two things going on at once. First of all, I think pharma itself is in crisis. Just its own capitalist model, its own profit center model is in crisis. Most pharma companies are not going to be able to show the kind of returns on investment that their stock investors have counted on for the last 15 years. Their main blockbuster drugs are all coming off patent across the board, and they don't have much in the pipeline. So they're struggling, they're fighting for survival, and they're playing dirty along the way, and there's a lot of unsmart, if not just out-and-out stupid things that drug companies have been doing to try and protect their market positions. Now, the smarter among them are beginning to take a new kind of strategy that may pose a new set of problems. It's so novel that it's unfolding right now, and we'll see how it plays out. But they're beginning to feel that their real marketplace of the future is in the BRICS countries. So the battlefield is on market position for the sale of your drugs, whether they're off-label or not, whether they're still patented or not, inside China, inside India, inside Brazil, inside Mexico, inside Indonesia, and so on. And those countries, of course, say, well, wait a minute, we don't want you to come in and undermine our local manufacturing capacity. So there's a power and market battle going on inside the emerging market countries. I don't think you can say what it'll look like in 5 years. It's just very new power struggle. Different countries are trying to handle it in various ways. Some have passed pretty darn tough tariff laws and used compulsory licensing and other mechanisms to keep the higher-priced American-made or European or Japanese-made product out of their marketplace. But we also see some really distortion impacts coming from other directions. One of the ones I find the most disturbing, and I don't have a real obvious answer for it, we had a fantastic breakthrough in meningitis A vaccination. Huge. In the last 3 months, all the control trials, everything, the seals broken, unbelievable. This is the holy grail of meningitis vaccination that we've been searching for 20 years. It's way cheaper than any currently available meningitis vaccine. Problem, the governments are not buying it. And they're not buying it because the old crappy meningitis vaccine is subsidized. And so this brilliant new innovation is going unused. If you think about that and project forward with some of the other things in the pipeline that are coming through because of Gates investment or PATH, another NGO efforts, or even things at the NIH, that could be very disturbing down the road. If we've created market distortions because of global health donation to ministries of health that actually keep better innovations out of the marketplace.
Hi, first off, thank you again for coming to speak with us today. I just wanted to ask a question about the human resources for health issue that you brought up. I know you moderated the panel on June 9th about the Can We Achieve MDG 6 with the workforce that we have today. And I guess I wanted to know what you thought were the biggest challenges with human resources for health. Is it migration of trained professionals? Is it not training enough professionals? Is it task shifting that we should be focusing on? And how do we address those issues and move forward with them?
Well, of course, it's all of the above, but the problem with the healthcare worker crisis is that both the origins of it and the solutions of it are highly variable. There is not a answer for the planet. You have to almost go country by country to understand the picture. We have an acute shortage of healthcare workers in the United States. And our shortage is due to a mix of inadequate levels being trained up, inadequate funding for nursing schools in particular, which tend to be land-grant university schools, and certain market decisions made about setting caps on the numbers of doctors, doctor candidates admitted to medical schools in order to not glut the marketplace, and that sort of thing. So we're actively recruiting healthcare workers from poor and middle income countries around the world. I remember I was in the Bahamas and went to what is the largest nursing school in the Caribbean. And this was about 7 years ago. And the head of the school said that almost 100% of the newly graduated class had gone straight to the United States. And these people had been supported by Caribbean government taxpayers. And ended up, being that lovely Caribbean accent you hear at the nurses' station in Dallas. So that's one piece of it. And the brain drain piece is very, very real. Ross Perot used that term, the big sucking sound. The big sucking sound is the rich countries sucking poor healthcare workers from poorer countries. But there's another piece to it, which is the cost of training. So Canada, which keeps trying to do the right thing, the last data set I saw indicated that only 27% of Canadian doctors were born and trained in Canada. So the vast majority of physicians practicing in Canada were born and or trained in countries where the cost of training up a doctor is far lower than the costs in Canada. That primarily means India. So you have this tidal wave of Indian doctors showing up here, but what's happening back home in India? I think the other piece that often gets overlooked is working conditions. If you're in Malawi today and you're an MD, you will be absolutely overwhelmed by HIV in your practice, by tuberculosis in your practice, by seeing a lot of death, way more than American physicians see, and with constant resource scarcities, with none of the toolkit that you may have had the opportunity to get trained to use in the UK or the United States, but there's no CAT scans, there's no MRIs, all these fancy schmancy things. And so there's a real morale problem. It's hard to keep well-trained individuals working under those conditions. And then when you just finally add to it that they may become infected whenever the barrier protections are minimal or underfunded, so that they're risking their lives to practice medicine, to be a nurse, to be a lab technician in a resource-poor country where control of infectious disease spread nosocomially is minimal or non-existent. So you put all this together, it's a pretty grim picture. It's a big challenge. There isn't time to train up enough doctors. There isn't time to train up enough nurses. So a lot of the healthcare worker crisis is going to have to be solved through innovative approaches to community health workers of one kind or another. And I think the place where we're seeing the most rapid innovations for that are both in midwifery and in dealing with HIV and TB. I don't think you can build a whole primary healthcare system, however, on the backs of a very poorly paid, semi-literate woman living in a rural village in a desperately poor country. There's going to have to be more innovative thinking, and I hope that some of you will get engaged in that.
I actually have a question. You mentioned like WHO and how different partners and who's big in the game. Do you see like private-public partnerships? Like how is it possible in the future for these players to be collaborative in the future? And what will it take for them to be collaborative and support?
Well, the best funded giant is a public-private partnership, Gavi. Any place where the Gates Foundation has a more than 20% role, you have a public-private partnership. Many of the drug companies got into the business of being a collaborator in a PPP for PR reasons back when they were really under the gun for their pricing schemes on antiretrovirals. But some of them stayed the course and have taken more serious efforts. Botswana is probably the biggest recipient of successful PPP that is countrywide for all aspects of HIV and TB care. A collaboration between Merck, the Botswanan government itself, the Global Fund, and the Gates Foundation. And the result is they have universal access to antiretroviral therapy, and they're one of the few countries in the world that do. I think I'm talked out. One last question.
Recently, the Supreme Court made some ruling that benefits generic drug makers. How will that affect the World Health situation?
I don't think I can really answer that because I never read that Supreme Court ruling in detail, so I don't really know.
Well, how do you think generic, the role that they play in general?
You know, obviously, generic manufacturing is the best way to get prices down. Unfortunately, the initiative I'm working on now with the governments of Brazil, the United States, China, and the UK, that we hope to bring to the level of the G20 in the next round. It concerns a whole separate problem that affects both the generic and patent industries very dramatically, and that is that we've seen in the last 5 years a dramatic, I mean, catastrophic surge of the engagement of organized crime in pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter drugs and vitamins, pretty much the whole range of what we call medicines, so that Nigeria now estimates 70% of all treatment medications sold in Nigeria are fraudulent products. We've seen this huge dependency shift in terms of raw ingredients, which affects whether you're a generics manufacturer in Brazil, as I was just talking to them last week, or Merck over there in New Jersey. That we're all dependent on the same finite pool of raw ingredients for the pharmaceutical industry, and it turns out, in a smart play, India and China have completely taken over the raw ingredients market. So 100% of salicylic acid comes from China. Every time you take an aspirin, you're taking a little bite of China. Do you think it's right? Do you think it's working? Do you think it's safe? Guess what? They have no quality control. They have no inspections. 100% of ascorbic acid, vitamin C, does not come from the United States anymore. So every time you take a vitamin C tablet, you're trusting that a government overseas somewhere actually tested it. And we're getting an increase in problems associated with fraudulent raw ingredients and formulated products. And even if they're not fraudulent, if they're suboptimal, if the dosage is suboptimal, and you have a chronic disease that needs careful management, it
But
could in the long haul kill you.
The generics make these treatments more available to people in poor countries?
Yeah, I said that.
Well, I think, what's the largest generic drug manufacturer in the world?
You know, I don't know right now. I thought
I
it was
think it's-
Cipla.
You ever heard of Teva?
Yeah.
Is that one of the largest generic manufacturers in the world?
I'm not sure it's the largest. No,
It's one of the largest?
Yeah, what's your point?
My point is that when you blame Zionists or people who support Zionists as being bad for the health of the world, that's...
Who did that?
You did.
Oh, no, I did not.
I'll tell you what you said, and you tell me if you said that. You said, I'll tell you what you said. You said that woman from Florida, she's a double whammy. What's the double whammy? She's against Castro, and she married a super Zionist.
Yeah. So, I don't get the logic of your question, but anyway. I think I'm done because I'm
The logic
talked
of your
out.
question is that if you look at the number of patents in medicine and the aid that Israel gives throughout the world, and if you look at Teva, which is a gigantic generic manufacturer, which brings down and makes these things available, I don't think you should blame Zionism or people who are pro-Zionism as one of the factors that are double whammies and are bad for world health.
Point taken.
Okay. Thank you for those remarks. And please join me in thanking Laurie Garrett for those incisive and stimulating remarks.